Okay, so I will leave Cathy to talk about the survey and key challenges faced by the members of the Ontario nonprofits. Cathy?
Thank you so much, Francois. Can you see my screen? Did that work? All good?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. Cathy Taylor here from the Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory in Erin, Ontario. Apologies if there is a little bit of internet delay today. I do live in rural Ontario and broadband is sometimes an issue. So hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll work fine today. PhiLab has asked me to talk about the impact of the pandemic on nonprofits and charities, what we're learning, and any takeaways that we already have for the philanthropic and grant making community. So I'm going to spend my time specifically talking about some surveys that we did and what we're hearing from the sector in Ontario, and then some of our lessons learned already that I can share. So first of all, for those new to ONN, we're the independent network for over 58,000 nonprofits and charities in Ontario, and our focus is policy, advocacy, and services to help the sector thrive here in Ontario. And just a bit of context about the numbers as I talk about the impact of the pandemic. In our sector, we have employ 1 million people in Ontario, more than the mining and automotive industries in Ontario. 80% of whom are women, and this is a particular important note as we talk about the pandemic impact. Our latest numbers are that our sector contributes 50 billion in economic impact and engages 5 million volunteers. And half of that, our sector, half of those 58,000 nonprofits are completely volunteer driven. So our service clubs, small arts or sports organizations, community groups, and neighborhood centers. Another important piece about the context of our sector is that our compensation levels are typically lower than the national average. We do have some new information from Stats Canada that we haven't quite figured out yet the Ontario picture, but it looks like we're still lower than average in terms of compensation. And one important myth that we continue to bust, which I think is also relevant for the pandemic recovery, is that the nonprofit sector in Ontario receives less than half of its revenue from all three levels of government combined: municipal, provincial, and federal. And lots of folks think that nonprofits and charities get all their funding from governments, and we always have our hand out to government. And in fact, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. And that also impacts our ability to recover from the pandemic. So, early on, back in March of 2020, we knew early on that the pandemic was going to have an impact on nonprofits and charities. But we had no idea, as you all know, how long, what the duration of the pandemic would be, and how it would impact across the different types of organizations in our sector. So in March of 2020, we actually did what we called a flash survey the last week of March. So literally 3 weeks into the pandemic, just to have a baseline of how organizations, what was on their mind, how they were doing, what they were worried about, what the impact had been so far. And again, if you recall back, I found an email I sent to my colleagues at that time that said, we're closing the office as of March 11th, and we look forward to reopening on April 4th. So we all thought, this was only going to be a 3 or 4 week adventure. And of course, we're not back in the office yet. So it's been a 14-month adventure so far. But that early survey was really helpful to us because it showcased what some of the trends and issues for us to follow throughout the last year and a bit. So already by March of 2020, by the end of March, this survey was a crowdsourced survey, a rolling survey. We had 500 organizations respond, fairly representative sample from across the subsectors. 75% had already felt an impact from reduced fundraising, from canceling events and fundraising events and reduced fundraising from donors where there was uncertainty about where the pandemic was going. 1 in 5 closed their doors and did not provide any services at all already by the end of March. Over a third laid off staff even within that first 3 weeks or reduced staff hours because they were uncertain about the future. And a few other tidbits that we learned from this survey, and this is all on our website, it's publicly available, and I can put the link in the chat. But at that point, we were calling it a triple threat, that nonprofits and charities were facing the triple threat of revenue loss, operational challenges, and human resource challenges. So half of the organizations we surveyed had less than 3 months reserves, so could not sustain themselves beyond 3 months. 40% were also seeing an increase in the demand for services. So at the same time that they had less revenue, less staff, the demand for services was going up. 1 in 5, as I mentioned, completely closed, and this affected every part of the sector. And what we already heard at that point was that supports, government supports, philanthropic supports could not come fast enough. Because they were worried about the economic rebound for our sector was going to take a longer time than it would for the business sector. So, for example, a restaurant or the tourism industry. And we also heard loud and clear that organizations were worried about their staff and volunteers, from having access to personal protective equipment, to paid sick days, to how they were going to manage childcare when the schools were closed. So a lot of concern around the people in the sector. So at that time, we continued to do policy analysis and updates to the sector about what was happening. We created a bunch of resources, hosting weekly webinars with industry experts in HR and finance, and really upped our game, as well as many of our counterparts nationally and across the country, to advocate to funders and to government about what the sector needed. So fast forward another 3 months. So in June 2020, we recognized that we needed more information about how the sector was doing. And we were getting asked from governments specifically, as well as from funders and foundations, what now did the sector need and what has changed. So we did another sector survey, this one a bilingual survey in partnership with LAFO in Ontario and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And what we discovered at that time was that we had a bigger survey sample size, about 1,100 organizations. Of those 1,100 organizations, so those that answered the survey, there was a total loss of $90 million in revenue, just of those 1,100 organizations. And so think about the impact if we extrapolate those numbers for the entire nonprofit sector in Ontario and in Canada. One of the big questions we asked at that time, charities getting support federal and provincial governments, and the answer was a resounding no. 75% had no support from the provincial governments, 2/3 nothing from the federal government, that those programs were not working for them. And at that time, there was only a few programs announced by June, that the wage subsidy, for example, and a few others. And so we do know that those numbers will have changed since that point. And the trend around the increase demand in services was continuing. So 2/5 respond that they had a greater demand for their services than they even had in March. So at this point, at the 3-month point, what we were hearing loud and clear from the sector was that the pandemic was having a devastating impact. There was a lack of government supports. And yet when we asked questions about optimism and resilience, the sector was still very optimistic and resilient about the future, which was a little bit surprising. 1 in 5 at that time said that they were expecting to close their doors permanently. That's 20%. And if you think of 20% of nonprofits and charities in Ontario, that's 10,000 organizations. So we were incredibly concerned about that number. And 23% expected their situation to get worse. And that amount was higher for arts organizations and sports organizations, where about 40% expected the situation to get worse in the next year. By that time, by June, 1/3 had fully laid off staff, 60% had experienced dramatic revenue losses, and 35%, over 1/3, had used up all of their reserves. And one of the big findings that I really found uncomfortable was that 10% of nonprofit and charity leaders were using their own money to pay the staff and keep the organization afloat because they felt they had nowhere to go, they weren't able to get lines of credit or any other additional supports. And as I mentioned, the government support was inadequate. So since then, so what that led for us was to continue to advocate, especially on 3 areas: immediate financial support to nonprofits and charities, addressing their role as an economic contributor to our economy, a specific supports for employer and workers supports, so enhancing the wage subsidy program, paid sick days, access to PPE, ensuring that nonprofits and charities that were continuing to work were deemed essential services, and then supporting the sector to be part of those conversations about reopening and recovery, and to be at the table when decisions were being made. So now, back 14 months later, we're about to put a survey in the field next week, actually. So we're calling it the 1 year into the pandemic. I know it's a bit longer than a year, but we'll be putting a survey in the field in the next week. It'll be live for 3 weeks, so please share it. It'll be through our various communication channels. And we'll be looking at these baselines from last year and figuring out how organizations are doing, how have federal and provincial supports benefited the sector, what worked, what didn't work, what supports are needed to ensure an equitable recovery, and how can we as networks continue to collaborate and support nonprofits and charities. So we expect this report will also be fully bilingual, both the survey and the report, and we expect it to be the results to be publicly available by the end of June, early July. So in summary, a few things about what we're learning and some takeaways for grant makers. So what we've learned, not just through the surveys, but we've had conferences, webinars, lots of emails and phone calls and convenings throughout the year, that the impact is uneven based on the size of the organization, their geography, the subsector that they operate in, the type of funding that they get. The impact has not been consistent among nonprofits and charities. And those particularly that have been encouraged over the last 10 years to diversify their revenue and to prioritize earned income, to start a social enterprise, were actually in greater trouble than those that had a majority of government funding. We also heard, and you heard Andrew talk about this as well, we also learned that the impact of systemic racism was really what some are calling the shadow or double pandemic, has taken a greater toll on nonprofits and charities, and in particular their workers and the people that they serve. And not surprisingly, we learned that nonprofits are driven by people, and it's the people that have been struggling, from layoffs to burnout, for our volunteers, for our board members, and the importance of creating decent work and supporting our employers has never been more important. And finally, one of the lessons we've learned is that, in the past, those siloed structures of organizations working just on their own missions or just perhaps in their own subsector geography really haven't been working. And there's been tremendous opportunities and tremendous collaboration and partnerships that emerged from the pandemic. And the role of networks has never been more effective. And we need more networks, and we need to support our networks more as well. So, in terms of key issues for recovery, these are the top things on our mind. The paid workforce, which I already talked about, how we can support the paid workforce, particularly the care economy, as so many of the care jobs are in the nonprofit sector, and that has both a racialized and a gender perspective. Our volunteer workforce, and Volunteer Canada and Imagine Canada have put out lots of information about the impact on volunteerism as a result of the pandemic. The growth of grassroots and mutual aid networks, and how the structures of the nonprofit sector interact with the emergence of many more grassroots initiatives, and how we need to resolve some of those longstanding issues like direction and control and shared platforms. Certainly our revenue models are changing, and as I already mentioned, social enterprise and earned income. So how we adapt and grow is going to be a really important recovery conversation. We're already hearing concerns about government austerity coming and what that's going to look like if the debt and deficits at the federal and provincial levels continue to grow, and what the impact will be on the sector. Obviously, we're always paying attention to the modernization of our regulatory environment, and there's lots of chatter about modernizing our environment at the federal level, and that, quite frankly, can't come soon enough. I already mentioned how we can sustain the collaborations and partnerships that have developed through the pandemic is a key issue for our recovery. And finally, around technology, many organizations were not prepared to either work remotely as a staff team or provide programs and services remotely. And that has been a big gap that our sector needs to address. And I'm just going to wrap up with a few takeaways, I think, from our perspective for the philanthropic and grant-making sector. We certainly learned loud and clear that flexibility and adaptability is possible. So all of those times that grant makers and funders and government told us that there's no flexibility, I think we learned that it is possible. So we'd encourage you to keep being as flexible as you can. We learned that it is possible also to ease the administrative burden in terms of application processes and time between checks and reports required. And so again, there are ways to be accountable for money and for programs and projects, while at the same time easing the administrative burden. Another lesson we learned, that it really is all about relationships and trust building. Having a relationship with your funder, with your grant, between funders and grantees is so important in terms of the recovery and how we move forward, and to be able to have those honest conversations about where you need support. Absolutely, we learned that reserves are critically important. So any funder or grant maker that had a policy of only allowing 3 months reserves needs to throw that out the window if they haven't already, and consider how they will support organizations that actually contribute to reserves, as well as the importance of general operating support, which allows organizations then to pivot if they need to be able to provide to buy laptops, for example, in a crisis. And my final comments, and I see I'm at the last couple minutes, that decent work funding is needed. Funders have an incredibly important role to play to ensure that nonprofits and charities are supporting their staff. You need to ask more questions about benefits and pensions and paid sick days. You need to be able to think about your long-term support for organizations versus short-term projects. And figure out, because it is the people that do the work in our sector. We've heard this before, but if you've been saving for a rainy day, it is still torrential out there, and organizations are struggling to survive, and and we need as much support as possible. We've learned, and a takeaway I think for the grant making and philanthropic community is to center racial and cultural equity, not just for your own organization, but how with your grantees, and help them and raise your expectations, and also diversify the people that you fund. And Andrew, of course, mentioned this specifically in terms of Black-led organizations. They use your voice to advocate for the sector. Foundation Philanthropy has a strong voice to play as advocates. And we need your help. We can't do this alone. And there's an opportunity to reinvent and recreate at this time. And we need your support to do that. So those are just some of the takeaways that we have experienced and heard about. And we look forward to sharing another survey with you in the very near future. Thanks, Francois.